How resilient is Russia? And is its eventual collapse possible or downright probable? Let's talk about it. Russian losses are frankly astronomical. To date, Western intelligence agencies report the Russian military has officially lost almost 90% of the crack air, sea, and naval forces it amassed at the start of the war. This includes thousands of tanks, a number approaching the total number of tanks possessed by the United Kingdom and Germany combined. It also includes tens of thousands of other mechanized vehicles, to say nothing of the 315,000 soldiers killed, wounded, and missing in action. A stark data point when you consider the fact that Russia only started its invasion with 360,000 troops. This scale of destruction for a great power dwarfs anything the world has seen in decades. Yes, the numbers are alarming. According to one declassified US intelligence assessment, the war has sharply set back 15 years of Russian effort to modernize its ground force, and all but ruled out its capacity to conduct meaningful offensive operations, which have failed to make major gains in Ukraine since early 2022. Another RAND study argued it will take years, perhaps even decades, for the Russian military and economy to recover from the damage already incurred. When you factor in the compounding operational and political red flags we've witnessed this year, bloodletting in Bakhmut and Avdiivka, political brinksmanship between the Kremlin and Prigozhin's mercenaries, the lack of any semblance of air supremacy, and the operational nullification of the Black Sea Fleet, to outsiders Putin's determination to press on and his dogged ability to cling on to the gains he has made appears almost miraculous, if not downright insane. Winter approaches, and it is a critical time for both Russia and Ukraine. Western funding packages teeter on the knife's edge, and Ukraine remains vulnerable. If, at the conclusion of its slow but ongoing counteroffensive, it cannot maintain the widespread political, economic, and military support it has enjoyed thus far, it will struggle to convince its global partners to keep their material pipelines open, and consequently, struggle to plan and execute future offensive operations into the new year. Russia has its own share of problems. Arguably, it's been fortunate to escape 2023 with much of its defensive front lines intact. Today we'll take a closer look at why, exploring not only how Putin continues to enjoy relative operational parity with his enemy, despite the endemic dysfunction we've seen in the Russian political and military apparatus, but how he has done so in the face of such grave military losses. After what was, in hindsight, an extremely disappointing year of Russian military setbacks, there was perhaps no greater symbol of the precarity of the Russian war effort than the whirlwind bout between Russia's mutinous mercenary leader and oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin and Putin's military cabinet led by Shoigu and Gerasimov. This was, for all intents and purposes, the biggest crisis in the Russian president's 2 decades in power, and it all started when Putin outsourced the battle for Bakhmut to the veteran armed contractors of Prigozhin's Wagner Group. As close friends and confidants, the two had worked together before, yet with each successive battle, Prigozhin's grumbling against his civil-military patrons grew more pronounced. At first, his popular Telegram videos, often posted from the front lines, called for arms and implements, bombs, artillery shells, and ammunition. As Wagner suffered upwards of 20,000 military casualties in Bakhmut, Prigozhin's tone changed. He seemed to finally realize systemic issues at play, that no matter how much equipment and tactical leeway Putin conferred on his troops, operational constraints imposed by Putin's military chiefs, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, and the Chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, rendered their sacrifices worthless. Prigozhin gave voice to a growing perception of strategic incompetence among the Russian military elite. Shoigu and Gerasimov could not keep their ill-trained conscripts in battle long enough to support the Wagner Group's advance, a reality tantamount to betrayal. He cited alleged instances of actual betrayal, fratricidal incidents he deemed deliberate. Prigozhin's inflammatory messages challenged Putin's legitimacy and ignited a blood feud between the Kremlin and the mercenaries last summer. This culminated in a shocking march on Moscow, where Prigozhin and 1,000 of his men mutinied and marched virtually unopposed up the M4 highway toward the Kremlin, capturing Russia's entire southern military headquarters sited in Rostov-on-Don in the process. Putin scrambled to extinguish the spreading spark of insubordination. While Moscow flung itself into a last-ditch defense of its major highways, airports, and government buildings, Putin publicly denounced Prigozhin and called for an orderly de-escalation of tension. Meanwhile, the world watched as the Russian state careened toward what seemed like its inevitable descent into anarchical civil war. This, however, never came to pass. A day later, the mutiny fizzled out. Prigozhin was whisked away into Belarus. A compromise settlement dropped all criminal charges in exchange for Wagner's removal from Russia. What was touted in the press as the beginning of the end for Putin's regime, in hindsight, looks as though it was simply a mere speed bump. The communist revolution at the end of World War I had proven sufficiently destabilizing to overthrow the Tsarist government. A costly intervention in Afghanistan had all but ended the Soviet Union's hopes of winning the Cold War and contributed to its sudden collapse. Yet the Wagner mutiny seemed to simply fade into oblivion. Its final act epitomized by published video of Prigozhin's smoldering plane falling quickly to earth. The Kremlin's run-in with Prigozhin was consonant with a seemingly unending slew of crises many commentators have been quick to cite as evidence of Putin's imminent collapse since the Russian president came to power. The rapidity with which Ukraine recaptured tens of thousands of miles of occupied territory at the end of 2022 was one such example. Then, as now, such prognostications proved misguided. Take as additional examples the countless media reports contemplating the consequences of Putin's alleged ill health, high-level defections which claimed he was losing his grip on his subordinates, and mass protests at the start of Russia's 2022 invasion. Similar cases stretch back into the recent past. These include Putin's gross mishandling of Russia's COVID-19 pandemic response, perceptions that Zelensky's election in 2019 might undermine his authoritarian grasp on power, fears that other political opponents like Russia's incarcerated opposition leader Alexei Navalny might emerge as viable presidential contenders, or that Putin's incremental territorial revisionism, including his annexation of Crimea, invasion of the Donbass, and intervention in Georgia, might inflame global opinion and make Russia a political and economic pariah. Winding straight back through Russia's mid-2000s bungled responses to domestic terrorist attacks and the knock-on effects of the tanking Russian economy during the 2008 global financial crisis, and you see that part of Putin's political genius, if you can call it that, is his cockroach-like ability to roll with the punches. Public confidence in Putin remains high. He enjoys an 80% approval rating. Not that he has much competition these days. There isn't much incentive to challenge him on a grassroots level. Thousands of ordinary Russians were jailed as part of the country's fiercely repressive response to any and all anti-war demonstrations over the past 2 years. In the political realm, Alexei Navalny, Russia's most viable opposition leader, is doing 30 years in a Siberian penal colony with no credible promise he'll be released even if he completes his sentence. In light of its steep military losses, Russia's economy appears not only intact, but poised for rejuvenation, after enduring what many in the West considered the most crippling set of financial constraints ever imposed. In 2022, these measures were highly effective. Russia lost access to $300 billion of its foreign exchange reserves in G7 countries almost overnight. The ruble contracted by a quarter against the US dollar. Price caps penalized Russian oil sales, and Russian industrial players and banks suffered punishing export restrictions on mundane and specialized resources alike. Like their leader and their military, wily Russian economists have slowly adapted to these sanctions. By the end of 2022, the Russian economy had contracted by 2.1%, an order of magnitude less than the almost 30% hit sustained by Ukraine. As bad as this was, it still wasn't as bad as the Russian economy got during the recent COVID-19 pandemic. But what really boggles the mind is the recent prediction, forecasted by the International Monetary Fund, that Russia's economy is actually set to grow in 2023 and 24, as it more than doubles its military spending, identifies workarounds to import forbidden goods via third-party countries, and by employing a shadow fleet of oil tankers and fraudulent bookkeeping to undermine the oil price gap. The West has reportedly imposed more than 13,000 sanctions on Russia since the start of the war. Have Western sanctions failed? Is the spike in Russian military spending artificially masking deeper economic vulnerabilities? Are Western nations going too easy on export controls? Ultimately, can Western economic pressure help compensate for Ukraine's battlefield setbacks over the long term? Answers to these questions aren't easy to come by, yet bound up in them is a partial explanation for why Putin's regime has proven so resilient. Russia not only has seemingly boundless quantities of natural resources like oil, gas, and coal, it retains contact with nations who, regardless of the moral implications, are keen to receive said resources at reduced prices. In some cases, their very development depends on it, and this has serious implications for Russia's military in Ukraine, because Russian power is directly correlated with its economic prospects, and because its economic prospects remain, relative to their operational situation, stable for the moment, it's unlikely Putin's regime or his military will collapse anytime soon. Here's what you need to know about the Russian economy. It's one of the world's only true petrostates, with a quarter of the globe's natural gas reserves, 15% of its coal reserves, the sixth most oil reserves, and a population nowhere near large enough to consume it all. Russia's income hinges on massive exports to neighboring consumers who, themselves, lack access to such resources. Russia's economic dependency on foreign exports cannot be overstated. The oil and gas sectors account for almost half of its annual budget, after all. Over the past few decades, Russia has sought to maximize its profits by selling cheap energy in the form of oil and gas to regional communities like the EU. They spent years building pipelines across Europe precisely to facilitate the exchange of these types of goods, and then Putin invaded Ukraine. Fearing the renewed threat to its own territorial sovereignty, Europe quickly lost its appetite for Russian goods. Joining in support of Ukraine, the EU decided to take the measures in tandem with the United States and other nations to rapidly revoke Russia's rights to export goods to Europe. This started by limiting Russian seaborne imports of oil. They also ended the inflow of natural gas through the Nord Stream 2 pipelines in the Baltic Sea, replacing it with gas from the United States and Qatar. Russia soon found itself locked out of Europe. It was sitting on a mountain of resources and nowhere to sell it. This, however, didn't happen overnight. The Western world couldn't afford to prevent Russia from selling its goods elsewhere, nor could it enforce such a policy even if it wanted to. Yes, if it could, then, shorn of almost 50% of its annual budget, the Russian military would almost inevitably collapse. What you would see would be global economic anarchy as a tenth of the world's oil supply simply dropped out of circulation overnight. Markets would fail. Inflation would skyrocket more than it already has. Amidst greater scarcity, the cost of oil worldwide would skyrocket to unprecedented levels. So if the West can't afford to cut off Russia's energy exports altogether, what has it done? In the short term, the answer has been to impose what is known as a price cap sanction. The West continues to allow Russian companies to ferry their goods worldwide and engage on the international market insofar as they agree to sell their goods at or below a benchmark price. In the case of oil, where most countries can sell a barrel anywhere between $70 and $80 per item, Russia has to decide whether it wants to continue selling at traditional outlets for a fraction of the price the G7 countries can make, or if they want to look for new clients elsewhere. Looking elsewhere might not be as good as it sounds. While it can certainly find willing buyers for oil sold at Black Friday level markdowns in places like the Far East, Asia, Africa, and South America, geographic proximity figures heavily in making the whole operation make financial and logistical sense. This is why they were so heavily invested in Europe in the first place. Right next door, it only cost Russia about $3 to ship a barrel west. Rerouting these shipments to the global south doubles the cost of shipping. Not only that, but it makes it harder for the Western firms who traditionally handled much of the original trade routes to buy in. Russian shipping companies quickly found a workaround. Let's just contract a bunch of foreign shipping firms to deliver our oil to the far reaches of the globe, they reasoned. Working with intermediaries outside the Western gaze would enable them to circumvent the $60 per barrel oil cap and make significantly more than they otherwise could. Russian companies found traders willing to work new routes, re-registered others in countries without sanctions, and quickly found an agreeable system. The more tankers flocked to Russian ports, the lower freight rates became, another surprising benefit for Russia. Over time, the use of a shadow fleet of more than 500 antiquated shipping tankers from companies mostly registered in the Middle East, Africa, China, Latin America, and even Russia enabled Russia to divert many of its original export goods into new markets. The West has tried to respond by imposing a new round of sanctions on tanker owners participating in the sale of Russian oil based in Turkey and in the United Arab Emirates. Yet the West is still trying to devise ways to combat Russia's ability to sidestep the effect of their sanctions altogether, at least in the realm of energy exports. While the oil price cap worked throughout 2022, about midway through 2023, Russia had managed to deliver most of its oil sales away from the EU and US routes into far less familiar Asian and Far Eastern markets. To its surprise, it found neutral nations like India eager to gobble up its cheaper stockpiles. Today, Indian consumption of Russian oil has skyrocketed from a high of 3% in 2021 to about 40% in 2023. By comparison, its original primary supplier, Saudi Arabia, has seen itself increasingly edged out of the market. China is more involved in Russian oil imports, with competition equally fierce between Russia and Saudi Arabia for the critical Chinese market. The impasse has forced both to come to a mutual agreement to curtail their oil production by as much as 300,000 barrels a day to reduce the size of their burgeoning surplus. This, they predicted, would raise the price of each barrel in turn and increase revenue. In the West, the fluctuation of global oil stock prices has forced nations like the United States to increase their production to record highs just to offset the inflationary knock-on effect of Russia and Saudi Arabia's decision. The result is an ongoing global oil struggle, with the East and West locked in a deadly cycle as each attempts to constrain the other while keeping their own economic lifelines intact. These measures have seen global oil prices skyrocket well above even the targeted cap price, enabling Russia to add far more revenue than it otherwise could. At home, Russia is gearing up for the economic long haul. It knows the longer it can keep Ukraine in limbo, the greater chance it will have to curtail the pipeline of Western aid. Experts at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, for example, claim Russia's announced 2024 budget hints that it's ramping up the mobilization of its economy in order to sustain a longer war. For the first time in modern history, they write, the country is set to spend 6% of gross domestic product on the military, and defense spending will exceed social spending. The war against Ukraine and the West is not only the Kremlin's biggest priority, it's now also the main driver of Russia's economic growth. What this means is that Russia's defense spending is now the highest it's been since the Cold War, one-third that of its most consequential partner, China. Russia has realized that the more it spends on the war in Ukraine, the more it's able to replenish its dilapidated defense industry. If the conflict stagnates, all the better. It can continue to pump money into its military-industrial complex, which then trickles down into domestic society as a whole. The State Duma predicts that revenues will triple into 2024, social spending will increase sevenfold, education, healthcare, and the like will remain steady, and inflation will be negligible. It's all looking rather good. How exactly does that work? Isn't Russia unable to match the current rate of loss among its military? Won't massively inflated military spending programs doom an already shaky Russian economy? Yes and no. Russia currently has a lot of financial responsibilities. Foremost is the fact that it has to pay its recruits about $2,000 a month, that is, when they actually pay on time. This, by comparison, is around 3 times the national median monthly salary for military-aged males. The fact they can earn far more in the military than they ever could working in a factory deep in the Urals provides a strong personal incentive to join. What's more, if they die, which seems very common these days, Putin promises their families a $52,000 bonus, 3 times the median annual salary for a Russian family. There have already been more Russian war dead in 2 years than the United States lost in Vietnam and the Soviet Union lost in Afghanistan combined. What that means is that there have been a lot of payouts to the families of the deceased, along with government-subsidized mortgages, pensions, and other salaries. And what that means is that there has been a massive influx of expendable income pumped back into the Russian economy, which has more than compensated for negative fallout from sanctions imposed by the Western powers. The path ahead is relatively clear for Russia. It doesn't need to print out an ungodly amount of extra cash to make it all work. All it has to do is maintain its historic deficit while their oil and gas revenues recover, and Bob's your uncle. According to one commentator, Russia can afford to run at its current deficit level for a half a century until it comes close to approaching current American levels of debt. That's a startling observation. Today in Russia, defense production is in full swing. Its civilian industries are matching pre-war production levels, and Russian unemployment is at an all-time low. Yet we feel we should issue a word of caution. It won't all be sunshine and rainbows for the Russian war economy moving forward. Russia's defense sector is historically inefficient in its management and profitability. For example, in 2022, a Russian state-owned defense conglomerate known as Rostec actually managed to make less income from the sale of weapons and military equipment in 2022 than it did in 2020. The Russian space agency is hemorrhaging cash. One state-owned shipbuilding corporation is in the same boat, pun intended. Experts believe the projected growth in Russian military spending is an attempt to keep pace with these costs. As the ruble continues its steady devaluation, the cost of military equipment will only rise. Similar to its shadow fleet, Russia has tried to sidestep the impact of sanctions by purchasing critical Western-made components like semiconductors, computer chips, lasers, and other technological equipment from unsanctioned border countries like Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan at a slightly marked-up price. The same thing is happening in China and Turkey. Today, the West is trying to find new ways to incentivize these countries to stop these practices, but trying to control Russia's access to far-flung global markets is like trying to control a many-headed hydra, similar to attempting to limit oil exports using crude price cap controls. If you eliminate one market, another presents itself. In order to truly slow down the Russian economy, a country or coalition of countries would have to essentially sanction not only Russia, but every country adjacent to Russia, and do this with such strict measures that Russia becomes virtually sealed off from the outside world. As we've discussed today, doing this would not just impact Russia's own ability to functionally subsist, but would inject chaos into the global marketplace. With certain countries entirely dependent on Russian business and energy exports, this is simply impossible. Russia has a way of surprising us, however, and just might find a way to implode its own economic lifelines all on its own. Demographically, Russia, like many countries, possesses an aging population in terminal decline. The more fighting-aged men it deprives from its labor force, the harder it will be to increase industrial productivity, something it will inevitably have to do if the war escalates in any way. Sweeping conscription drives are already unpopular and will continue to be so as they impact the economy's ability to remain afloat. With spending so skewed towards the defense sphere, social spending will suffer. Russia's dependence on tech imports to maintain its military effectiveness means inflation will continue to creep higher and higher. This will leave the Kremlin with few options. Abandon the war altogether and seek rapprochement with the West, an option Putin seems remiss to adopt in light of the fact that it would cause a significant shock to the Russian economic system, or he can simply lock the country in for the long haul. Overhauling the economy to remain on a war footing indefinitely may result in short-term prosperity, relative to what things were like in 2022 at least, yet it may also force the economy, as one expert eloquently put it, into the snare of perpetual war. Put in this context, Putin's decision to dig in and deadlock the struggle in a deadly stalemate over the past year makes full economic sense. Unless the Russian economy tanks, which admittedly it appears unlikely to do, Putin's popularity will remain intact. Yet we should all remember that we've seen this movie before. Unchecked military spending over imprecise amounts of time in economies over-reliant on singular industries, sounds an awful lot like the Cold War. Living conditions will eventually deteriorate. Critical industries will increasingly struggle to source the maintenance and technological parts they need. Brain drain caused by the loss of hundreds of thousands of fleeing Russians, endemic migrant worker shortages caused by the fact that due to sanctions, workers are simply unable to send their wages back home. All this constitutes a deadly cycle. As Russia runs out of labor and thus becomes unable to supply its soldiers, it could result in potentially devastating political consequences. But what does Putin care? He has 47 million men of military age to draw from, compared to only 15 million in Ukraine. This critical 3-to-1 advantage will pay dividends in a war of attrition, especially because Putin knows Ukraine also needs a 3-to-1 advantage for their ongoing offensive operations to have a chance of penetrating his military defenses, and that number is generally only applicable when the aggressor enjoys some semblance of air power. It's now a waiting game. Winter will put a freeze on operational mobility for the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, the sinews of Putin's power continue to hum along. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments section below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content and analysis from military experts.